The wind howled through the canyon walls like the cries of the damned, carrying with it the metallic scent of blood and the sharp bite of winter's approach. Maria Gonzalez pressed her back against the rough-hewn door of her cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared at the figure standing in her doorway. The mountain man's clothes were torn and stained crimson, his face a mask of exhaustion and something deeper, something that spoke of violence and desperation. But it was the bundle in his arms that made her breath catch in her throat, a tiny form wrapped in what had once been a clean blanket, now streaked with mud and worse. The baby's cry pierced the silence, thin and desperate, and Maria felt something shift inside her chest. The man swayed on his feet, his knees threatening to buckle, and she saw the plea in his eyes even before he spoke. His voice, when it came, was rough as gravel, worn thin by exhaustion and pain. "Please," he whispered, and the single word carried the weight of worlds. "The child needs help." Maria's hands trembled as she reached for the bundle, her mind racing back to how this moment had come to pass. How a simple act of kindness on a storm-swept evening had led to this blood-soaked confrontation that would change everything she thought she knew about survival, about trust, and about the fierce protective instincts that could drive even the gentlest soul to acts of desperate courage. But let me tell you how it all began. 3 weeks earlier, when the first autumn storm of the season brought more than rain to Maria's isolated mountain cabin. The evening had started like so many others in the high country, with Maria stirring a pot of beans over her small wood stove, while the wind rattled the shutters of her one-room cabin. She had been living alone on the mountain for 2 years now, ever since her husband's death in a mining accident had left her with nothing but debts in the small plot of land he had claimed in the wilderness. The isolation suited her grief, the silence of the peaks a balm to her wounded heart. She was ladling the simple meal into a wooden bowl when the knock came, so soft she almost missed it over the storm's fury. Maria froze, spoon halfway to her mouth. Visitors were rare in these parts, especially after dark, and especially in weather like this. The nearest settlement was a hard day's ride through treacherous mountain passes, and most folks had sense enough to seek shelter long before the sun set on a night like this. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by a sound that made her blood run cold. A baby's cry, thin and desperate, barely audible over the wind, but unmistakably real. Maria set down her bowl with shaking hands and moved toward the door, her bare feet silent on the rough wooden floor. "Who's there?" she called, her voice barely steady. "A traveler," came the reply, deep and gravelly, strained with exhaustion. "Please, ma'am." "The child is cold." Maria's hand hovered over the wooden bar that secured her door. Every instinct screamed caution. She was a woman alone, vulnerable, with no neighbors for miles and no way to call for help if this stranger meant her harm. But that cry came again, weaker now, and she felt her resolve crumble. She lifted the bar and opened the door just wide enough to peer out into the storm. The man standing on her threshold was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair plastered to his skull by the driving rain. His clothes were rough but clean, the kind worn by trappers and hunters who spent their lives in the wilderness. But it was the bundle in his arms that captured her attention. A small form wrapped in what looked like a man's shirt, tiny fists visible above the makeshift swaddling. "Please," the man said again, and Maria heard the desperation beneath his careful control. "I've been walking for hours. The child needs warmth and food if you have any to spare." Maria studied his face in the flickering light of her oil lamp. His features were weathered and hard, marked by years of harsh living. But his eyes held no threat, only a bone-deep weariness and concern for the infant in his arms. She made her decision in that instant, stepping back to allow him entry. "Come in, quickly," she said, closing the door behind him and replacing the bar. "You're both soaked through." The man stumbled slightly as he crossed the threshold, and Maria realized he was more exhausted than he had let on. She guided him to the chair beside her small table, watching as he carefully adjusted his hold on the baby, his large hands surprisingly gentle. "Thank you," he said simply, and she heard genuine gratitude in the words. "I'm Jose Walker. This is my nephew, Tommy." Maria nodded, moving to stoke the fire in her stove. "Maria Gonzalez." You said you'd been walking for hours? Where did you come from? Jose's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Up the mountain. There was trouble at my brother's place. He and his wife. They're gone now. The boy's all that's left. The simple words carried a weight of tragedy that made Maria's chest ache. She had lost her own husband, knew the hollow ache of sudden grief, but to lose both parents at once, to be left with a helpless infant in the wilderness, that was a burden she could barely imagine. I'm sorry, she said softly and meant it. How old is he? 6 months, maybe 7. He's been crying for hours. I think he's hungry, but I don't have anything to give him. Maria looked at the tiny face visible above the makeshift blanket, the child's features red and pinched with cold and hunger. The baby had stopped crying for the moment, but she could see the exhaustion in the way his small body lay limp against Jose's chest. I have some goat's milk, she said, moving to her small pantry. It's not ideal, but it should help until we can figure out something better. She warmed the milk carefully, testing the temperature against her wrist the way she had seen her sister do with her own children years ago. Jose watched her every movement, his dark eyes never leaving her face, and she wondered what he saw there. Trust, perhaps, or simple human kindness. Whatever it was, it seemed to ease some of the tension from his shoulders. The baby took the milk eagerly, his tiny hands grasping at the cloth Maria had fashioned into a makeshift nipple. Jose held him with practiced ease, and she realized this wasn't the first time he had cared for the child. There was a tenderness in the way he supported the small head, adjusted the feeding angle, that spoke of genuine affection despite the tragic circumstances. You've done this before, she observed, settling into the chair across from him. Jose nodded, his attention focused on the feeding infant. My brother and his wife, they asked me to watch Tommy sometimes when they went to town for supplies. Sarah, that was her name. She taught me how to hold him, how to feed him. His voice caught slightly on his sister-in-law's name, and Maria saw the grief he was trying so hard to contain. What happened to them? She asked gently. Jose was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. The storm continued to rage outside, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling through the eaves. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Raiders, he said. 3 men, maybe 4. They came at dawn when we were all still sleeping. I was in the barn checking on a sick horse. I heard the shots, saw the smoke. By the time I got to the house, it was too late. Maria's hand went to her throat, imagining the horror of it. The baby? Hidden under the bed. Sarah must have put him there when she heard them coming. Smart woman. Always thinking ahead. Jose's voice was thick with emotion, and Maria saw his jaw clench as he fought for control. Did you see them? The men who did it? Jose's eyes went hard, and for a moment Maria glimpsed something dangerous beneath his grief. I saw enough. 3 of them, riding south toward the valley settlements. One had a scar across his left cheek, another was missing fingers on his right hand. The third was young, maybe 20, with yellow hair and cruel eyes. The description sent a chill through Maria. She had heard stories of raiders in these parts, men who preyed on isolated homesteads, taking what they wanted and leaving death in their wake. The law was thin in the high country, and justice often came at the end of a rifle barrel rather than from any court. You should report this to the sheriff in Millerville, she said, though even as she spoke the words she knew how hollow they sounded. Millerville was 3 days' hard ride from here, and by the time Jose could make the journey and bring back help, the raiders would be long gone. Jose seemed to read her thoughts. The sheriff's a good man, but he's got more territory than he can handle and not enough deputies to cover it. These men, they know the country, know how to disappear. They've probably done this before. The baby had finished feeding and was beginning to drift off to sleep, his tiny fist curled against Jose's chest. Maria watched the man's face soften as he looked down at the child, saw the protective instinct that had driven him to walk for hours through a storm to seek help. You can't raise a child alone in the wilderness, she said, though she kept her voice gentle. He needs stability, safety. There are families in the settlements who might take him in, give him a proper home. Jose's arms tightened almost imperceptibly around the sleeping infant. He's family, my brother's blood. I won't give him up to strangers. There was steel in his voice, a determination that brooked no argument. Maria recognized that tone, had heard it in her own voice when well-meaning neighbors had suggested she sell her husband's claim and move back to town after his death. Some bonds couldn't be broken by logic or practicality. Then you'll need help, she said simply. A baby needs more than you can provide on your own. Proper food, warm clothes, medicine when he's sick. And winter's coming. You can't keep him warm in a tent or a rough cabin when the snow starts to fall. Jose was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the child in his arms. When he looked up, Maria saw the vulnerability he had been trying so hard to hide, the fear of a man who had taken on a responsibility far beyond his experience. I don't know how to be a father, he admitted. I'm a hunter, a trapper. I know how to track game and survive in the wilderness. But a baby, I don't even know what he needs, when he needs it. If you hadn't been here tonight, if you hadn't helped us, I don't know what I would have done. The admission cost him, Maria could see that. Men like Jose Walker weren't accustomed to showing weakness, to admitting they needed help. But the child in his arms had stripped away his pride, left him raw and desperate. You did the right thing, she said softly. You brought him somewhere safe, somewhere warm. That's what a father does, protects his child no matter what it costs him. Jose met her eyes and she saw something shift in his expression. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of trust. Would you, he began, then stopped, seeming to gather his courage. Would you consider helping us? Just for a while, until I can figure out what to do next. I can pay you, not much, but I have some gold dust from my last trap line, and I can hunt, bring you meat for the winter. Maria felt her heart skip as she considered his request. The practical part of her mind cataloged all the reasons to say no. She barely knew this man, had only his word that he was who he claimed to be. Taking in a stranger and a baby would mean sharing her limited supplies, putting herself at risk if the raiders Jose described came looking for survivors. Her cabin was small, barely adequate for one person, let alone three. But as she looked at the sleeping child, so small and vulnerable in his makeshift swaddling, she felt something stir in her chest that had been dormant since her husband's death. Purpose? Perhaps. Or simply the basic human need to nurture and protect. She had been living in isolation for 2 years, speaking to no one for weeks at a time, slowly forgetting what it meant to be part of something larger than her own grief. I don't have much, she said finally. This cabin, a few chickens, a goat. My husband's mining claim, though I've never worked it myself. It's not an easy life, especially with winter coming. I'm not looking for easy, Jose replied. Just save. Somewhere Tommy can grow up without looking over his shoulder, without wondering if today's the day someone comes to hurt him. Maria nodded, understanding all too well the desire for sanctuary. There are conditions, she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. This is my home, my rules. The baby comes first, always. If he needs something and we have to choose between his welfare and our own comfort, he wins. And if I ever feel that either of you is a danger to me or to him, you leave immediately. No arguments, no explanations. Jose's eyes never left her face as she spoke, and she saw respect there, perhaps even admiration for her directness. Agreed, he said without hesitation. And Maria, I want you to know, if those men ever come here, if they ever threaten you or Tommy, they'll have to go through me first. I couldn't save my brother and Sarah, but I won't fail again. The promise was spoken quietly, but Maria heard the absolute conviction behind the words. This was a man who had already lost everything that mattered to him once. He wouldn't let it happen again. Then we'll make it work, she said, and felt a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying lift from her shoulders. For now, you and Tommy can sleep by the fire. Tomorrow we'll figure out more permanent arrangements. Jose nodded gratefully, settling back in the chair, with the sleeping infant still cradled against his chest. Maria busied herself preparing bedding, spreading her spare blankets near the warmth of the stove. But her mind was already racing ahead to the challenges they would face. Food would be the immediate concern. Her supplies were adequate for one person through the winter, but feeding 3 would require careful rationing and supplementing with whatever game Jose could provide. Then there was the matter of the baby's needs. Tommy would require more than goat's milk as he grew, would need proper clothes as the weather turned cold, medicine if he fell ill. The nearest doctor was in Millerville. a journey that would be impossible once the snow started falling in earnest. But perhaps most concerning was the threat Jose had described. If the raiders who had killed his brother and sister-in-law learned of survivors, they might come looking. Maria's cabin was isolated, defensible to a degree, but against multiple armed men, it would be little more than a trap. She glanced at Jose, noting the way his hand rested near the knife at his belt even in sleep, the alertness that never quite left his posture. This was a man accustomed to danger, to living on the edge between civilization and wilderness. Perhaps that experience would be enough to keep them safe. As the storm began to abate outside, Maria settled into her own bed, listening to the soft breathing of the man and child who had so suddenly entered her life. 3 weeks ago, she had been a widow living in isolation, her days marked only by the basic rhythms of survival. Now she was part of something she hadn't dared hope for again. A family of sorts, bound together by necessity and loss, but perhaps destined for something stronger. She had no way of knowing, as she drifted off to sleep, that the real test of their newfound bond was still to come, that the men Jose had described were indeed looking for survivors, and that within days they would face a confrontation that would force them all to discover just how far they were willing to go to protect what they had found together. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised Maria with its naturalness. Jose proved to be everything he had promised, and more, rising before dawn to check the snares he had set around the cabin, returning with rabbits and sometimes larger game that he cleaned and prepared with efficient skill. He repaired the loose boards on her chicken coop, reinforced the door and shutters of the cabin, and began work on a proper cradle for Tommy using wood from fallen trees. Tommy, for his part, seemed to thrive under their combined care. The goat's milk agreed with him, and Maria supplemented it with thin broths and eventually small amounts of mashed vegetables from her garden. The baby's cries became less frequent, his sleep more peaceful, and Maria found herself looking forward to the moments when he would focus his dark eyes on her face and offer what might have been the beginning of a smile. Jose was a man of few words, but Maria learned to read the subtle signs of his moods, the way his shoulders tensed when he returned from hunting to report signs of other travelers in the area, the gentle way his voice softened when he spoke to Tommy, the careful distance he maintained from her own personal space, while still managing to be helpful and considerate. She began to understand that his silence wasn't unfriendliness, but rather the habit of a man accustomed to solitude, someone who had learned to conserve words the way others conserved food or ammunition. When he did speak, it was usually to share something practical, a weather observation or a suggestion about their preparations for winter, but sometimes she caught glimpses of the man beneath the careful exterior. "My brother used to say I talk too much," he told her one evening as they sat by the fire, Tommy sleeping peacefully in his new cradle. "Said I could talk the ears off a mule when I got started. Funny how things change." Maria looked up from the sock she was knitting, one of several she was making for the baby from unraveled yarn. "What did you talk about?" Jose was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Everything. Books I'd read, places I wanted to see, ideas about how the world worked. I had big plans back then. Thought I'd see San Francisco, maybe even go back east to the cities. My brother, he was the practical one. Said I had my head in the clouds." "What changed your mind?" "Life," Jose said simply. "You learn that dreams are a luxury most folks can't afford. Better to focus on what's real, what you can control." Maria nodded, understanding all too well. She had once dreamed of children, of a house full of laughter and the chaos of a growing family. Those dreams had died with her husband, buried beneath the weight of practical concerns and the daily struggle for survival. "Maybe dreams aren't meant to disappear completely," she said softly. "Maybe they just change shape, become something different than what we originally imagined." Jose looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip. Not romantic interest, exactly, but recognition, the acknowledgement of a kindred spirit who understood loss and adaptation. "Maybe," he agreed, and his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. It was 2 weeks into their arrangement when the first real test came. Maria was hanging laundry behind the cabin, Tommy sleeping peacefully in a basket at her feet, when she heard Jose's whistle from the tree line. It was a sound they had agreed upon, a signal that meant danger, strangers approaching, time to get inside and bar the door. Maria snatched up the baby and ran for the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jose appeared at the edge of the clearing moments later, his rifle in his hands, his face grim. "3 riders," he said tersely, following her inside and dropping the bar across the door. "Coming up the main trail. They're still a mile out, maybe more, but they're armed and moving with purpose." Maria felt her blood turn to ice. "The men from your brother's place?" "Can't tell from this distance, but it's possible. Either way, armed strangers aren't likely to be friendly. Not this far from the settlements." Jose moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. Maria joined him. Tommy clutched protectively against her chest. In the distance, she could see 3 dark figures moving along the trail that led to her cabin, still too far away to make out details, but close enough to confirm Jose's assessment. They were armed and they were coming directly toward her home. "What do we do?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "We wait," Jose said, checking his rifle and then moving to ensure his pistol was loaded and ready. "See what they want. Maybe they're just travelers looking for shelter or information about the trail ahead." But even as he spoke, Maria could see he didn't believe it. There was something about the way the men moved, the deliberate nature of their approach, that suggested this wasn't a chance encounter. "If they're the ones who killed your brother," she began. "Then we defend ourselves," Jose finished, his voice hard as granite. "I won't let them hurt you or Tommy. I promise you that." The riders were close enough now that Maria could make out individual details. 3 men, as Jose had said, all heavily armed and mounted on horses that looked travel-worn but strong. The leader was a large man with dark hair and what looked like a scar running down the left side of his face. Even at a distance, there was something about his posture, the way he sat his horse, that spoke of violence and cruelty. "It's them," Jose said quietly, and Maria heard the controlled fury in his voice. "The one in front, that's the man I saw riding away from my brother's place. The scar, the way he holds his head. It's him." Maria's arms tightened around Tommy, the baby stirring restlessly, as if sensing the tension in the air. "What do they want?" "Probably making sure there were no witnesses," Jose replied, his attention never leaving the approaching riders. "They might have seen smoke from the chimney, realized someone was living here. Or maybe they heard about Tommy somehow, know that someone survived." The riders had reached the edge of the clearing now, close enough that Maria could see their faces clearly. The leader was indeed scarred, the old wound pulling the left corner of his mouth into a permanent sneer. The man to his right was younger, with yellow hair and pale eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw with cold calculation. The third rider was older, his right hand obviously missing 2 fingers, and there was something in his expression that made Maria's skin crawl. They stopped just outside the cabin, making no immediate move to dismount but clearly studying the building, looking for signs of the occupants within. Maria could feel Jose's tension like a living thing beside her, could see the way his knuckles whitened as he gripped his rifle. "Hello, the cabin," the scarred man called, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "We're looking for information about some trouble up the mountain. Mind if we come in and talk?" Jose looked at Maria, a silent question in his eyes. She shook her head slightly. There was nothing friendly about these men, nothing that suggested they had any interest in simple conversation. "We're not looking for trouble," Jose called back, his voice carefully neutral. "Just trying to live peacefully. If you need supplies or directions, I can help you from here." The scarred man's laugh was harsh and unpleasant. "Now that's not very neighborly. We've been riding hard for days. Could use some warm food and a place to rest our horses. Surely you wouldn't turn away weary travelers." "There's a settlement half a day's ride south," Jose replied. "They'll have what you need." The 3 men exchanged glances, and Maria saw the yellow-haired one's hand drift toward the pistol at his hip. The pretense of friendly travelers was wearing thin. "See, here's the thing," the scarred man continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "We heard there might be survivors from a little incident up the mountain a few weeks back, a family that met with some unfortunate circumstances. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Jose's jaw clenched, but his voice remained steady. I don't know what you're talking about. Course you don't, the man replied, and now his sneer was fully visible. Just like you don't know anything about a baby that might have gone missing around the same time. Funny thing about babies, they're hard to hide. They cry, you see, make noise at all the wrong times. As if summoned by his words, Tommy chose that moment to let out a soft whimper, the sound barely audible, but apparently enough to confirm what the men had suspected. Maria saw triumph flash across the scarred man's face. Well now, he said, dismounting from his horse with deliberate slowness. Sounds like we might have found what we're looking for after all. The other two men followed suit, their hands now openly resting on their weapons. Maria felt Jose shift beside her, saw him bring his rifle to bear on the window. You need to leave, Jose called out, all pretense of politeness gone from his voice. Now, before this gets ugly. Oh, it's already ugly, friend, the scarred man replied, drawing his pistol. Has been since the moment you decided to interfere in business that wasn't yours. See, we can't have witnesses, and we especially can't have loose ends. That baby represents a very big loose end. Why? Maria found herself asking, the word escaping before she could stop it. Why does a child matter to you? The scarred man's attention shifted toward the sound of her voice, and his smile became even more unpleasant. Well, a woman. This just keeps getting better. He took a step closer to the cabin. You see, lady, that baby's daddy had something that belonged to us. Gold, to be specific. A lot of gold. We figured he'd hidden it somewhere, but the stubborn fool died before he could tell us where. Now, a man might hide gold anywhere, but a man with a baby, he's going to put it somewhere safe, somewhere the child can get to it when he grows up. Maria felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in her mind. Jose's brother hadn't been killed in a random raid. This had been targeted, planned, motivated by greed rather than simple violence. You're wrong, Jose called out. My brother was a trapper, nothing more. He didn't have any gold. Your brother, the scarred man repeated, and his laugh was genuinely amused. Well, that explains a lot. Family loyalty, very touching, but also very stupid. Your brother found a rich vein up in the high country, been working it quiet like for months. We know because we followed him, watched him, waited for the right time to take what was ours by right of being stronger and meaner. The admission hung in the air like a challenge, stripping away any remaining pretense. These weren't desperate men driven to violence by circumstances. They were predators, pure and simple, who had stalked and murdered Jose's brother and sister-in-law for gold that existed only in their own greedy imaginations. Even if that were true, Jose said, his voice deadly calm, what makes you think I know where this supposed gold is hidden? Maybe you don't, the scarred man admitted, but that baby will, eventually. Children have a way of remembering things, especially important things their parents tell them. We figure we'll take the boy, raise him proper-like, and when he's old enough, he'll lead us right to what we're looking for. The casual way he spoke of kidnapping and murder made Maria's blood boil. These men saw Tommy not as a child, but as a tool, a means to an end that they would discard the moment he was no longer useful. Over my dead body, Jose snarled, and Maria heard the promise of violence in his voice. That can be arranged. The yellow-haired man spoke for the first time, his voice high and nasal. In fact, that's exactly what we had in mind. The confrontation had reached its inevitable conclusion. There would be no negotiation, no peaceful resolution. These men had come to kill and take, and they wouldn't leave empty-handed. Jose must have reached the same conclusion because Maria saw his shoulders set, saw him take a deep breath, and settle into the focused calm of a man preparing for battle. Maria, he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the men outside, take Tommy to the back corner, behind the bed. Get down low and stay there no matter what happens. Jose, she began, but he cut her off. Do it now. And Maria, if something happens to me, if they get past me somehow, you take the baby and you run. There's a cave about a mile north, hidden behind a stand of pines. You remember the place I showed you when we were gathering firewood? Go there and hide until they're gone, then make your way to Millerville. Tell the sheriff what happened. Maria wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she wouldn't abandon him, but the urgency in his voice and the crying of the baby in her arms drove her to action. She moved quickly to the back of the cabin, crouching behind the heavy wooden bed frame with Tommy clutched against her chest. From her position, she could still see Jose at the window, could see the tension in his shoulders as he tracked the movements of the men outside. The scarred man was approaching the door now, his companions spreading out to flank the cabin. "Last chance," the scarred man called. "Open the door and hand over the baby, and maybe we'll make this quick for you and the woman." Jose's response was to fire a shot through the window, the bullet taking the scarred man in the shoulder and spinning him around. The man's scream of pain and rage was immediately followed by return fire, bullets splintering the wooden shutters and sending splinters flying through the cabin. Maria pressed herself lower, shielding Tommy with her body as the gunfight erupted in earnest. Jose moved with practiced efficiency, firing through different windows to keep the attackers guessing about his position, but Maria could see that he was badly outnumbered. 3 men with plenty of ammunition against 1 defender in a wooden cabin was not favorable odds. The attack came from multiple directions at once, while the scarred man, wounded but still dangerous, kept up a steady fire from the front of the cabin. His companions moved to attack the sides and back. Maria heard the sound of breaking glass as one of them smashed through the small window near the door, saw Jose spin to engage this new threat. The yellow-haired man came through the window in a rush, his pistol blazing, and Jose met him with the butt of his rifle. The heavy stock catching the intruder across the temple and dropping him to the floor, but the distraction cost him, and Maria saw the scarred man kick in the front door, his good arm bringing his weapon to bear on Jose's exposed back. Time seemed to slow as Maria watched the scene unfold. She saw the scarred man's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Jose beginning to turn, but knowing he would be too late, saw the muzzle flash that would end everything they had built together. But the shot never came. Instead, there was a different sound, the wet thud of an axe blade biting deep into flesh and bone. Maria looked up to see the third attacker, the one with the missing fingers, stumbling backward from the cabin's rear window, Jose's throwing axe buried deep in his chest. The scarred man's attention was drawn by his companion's death cry, and in that instant of distraction, Jose struck, his rifle butt catching the man under the chin and snapping his head back with brutal force. The scarred man went down hard, his pistol skittering across the floor, and Jose was on him immediately, his knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. "Please," the scarred man gasped, blood running from his mouth where Jose's blow had broken teeth. "Please, I'll leave. I'll never come back. Just let me go." Jose's face was a mask of controlled fury as he pressed the knife point against the man's throat. "Like you let my brother go? Like you would have let us go?" Maria saw the moment when Jose made his decision, saw the slight shift in his grip on the knife that meant death for the man beneath him. But before the blade could complete its deadly arc, she found herself speaking. "Jose, wait." He froze, his eyes finding hers across the cabin. In them, she saw not just anger but pain, the deep wound of loss that had been driving him since the night he had appeared at her door. "He killed my brother," Jose said, his voice rough with emotion. "Killed Sarah. They were good people, Maria. They didn't deserve what these animals did to them." "No, they didn't," Maria agreed, rising slowly from her hiding place. Tommy still clutched protectively in her arms. "And killing this man won't bring them back. It'll make sure he never hurts anyone else." Maria moved closer, stepping carefully around the unconscious form of the yellow-haired attacker. "Will it? Or will it just make you into the same kind of man he is?" Jose's hand trembled slightly, the knife point drawing a thin line of blood from the scarred man's throat. "He doesn't deserve mercy." "Maybe not," Maria said softly, "but you deserve better than carrying his death on your conscience for the rest of your life. You're not a killer, Jose. You're a protector. There's a difference." For a long moment, the cabin was silent except for the scarred man's labored breathing and Tommy's soft whimpering. Maria could see the war playing out in Jose's eyes, the desire for vengeance battling against the man he had been raised to be. Finally, slowly, he pulled the knife back. "What do you suggest we do with them?" Maria looked around the cabin, taking stock of their situation. One attacker was dead, killed in the heat of battle. The yellow-haired man was unconscious but breathing. The scarred leader was wounded and at their mercy. "We tie them up," she said. "All of them. Then we take them to Millerville, turn them over to the sheriff, let the law deal with them. The law, Jose said bitterly. The law didn't help my brother. No, but maybe it can help the next family these men would have targeted. Maybe it can help Tommy grow up in a world where justice means more than who's fastest with a gun. Jose studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, we'll do it your way. But Maria, if either of these men so much as looks at you or Tommy wrong during the journey to town, I won't hesitate to put them down. Fair enough, Maria agreed, and she meant it. Mercy was one thing, but foolishness was another entirely. They spent the next hour securing their prisoners, binding them with rope and checking their wounds to ensure they would survive the journey to Millerville. The yellow-haired man regained consciousness with a groan and a string of curses that made Maria glad Tommy was too young to understand language. The scarred man remained sullenly silent, his eyes burning with hatred and the promise of future violence. As they prepared for the journey, loading supplies and making arrangements for Tommy's care during the long ride, Maria found herself reflecting on how much had changed in the space of a few hours. This morning she had been a woman playing at being part of a family, uncertain of her place in the strange arrangement that had developed between herself, Jose, and the baby. Now she was a partner in every sense of the word, someone who had stood beside him in the face of mortal danger and proven herself worthy of trust. You could have been killed, Jose said quietly as they secured the last of their supplies. When that man came through the window, when the shooting started, you could have been hurt or worse. So could you, Maria replied. So could Tommy. That's what families do, isn't it? They protect each other, stand together when things get dangerous. Jose looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Is that what we are? A family? The question hung between them, loaded with implications and possibilities that neither of them had dared voice before. Maria felt her heart skip as she considered her answer, knowing that whatever she said would shape the future of their strange little household. I think we could be, she said finally, if that's what you want, what we all want. Jose's smile was small but genuine, the first truly happy expression she had seen from him since that first night when he had appeared at her door. I'd like that, he said. I'd like that very much. The journey to Millerville took 2 days, with their prisoners secured on horseback and Jose riding guard, while Maria managed Tommy and the pack animals. The scarred man made one attempt to escape during the first night, but Jose was ready for him, and after that the prisoners seemed to accept their fate with sullen resignation. Sheriff Edward Smith was a weathered man in his 50s who listened to their story with the weary attention of someone who had seen too much violence in his years of service. He examined the bodies they had brought, took statements from both Jose and Maria, and assured them that the surviving attackers would face justice for their crimes. You did the right thing bringing them in alive, the sheriff told them as they prepared to leave town. These men have been wanted for questioning in connection with several other attacks in the territory. Your testimony might help us close some old cases, bring peace to other families who've lost loved ones. As they made the journey back to Maria's cabin, now truly their home in every sense of the word, she found herself thinking about the path that had brought them to this point. 3 weeks ago, she had been a lonely widow, existing rather than living, marking time in isolation and grief. Now she was part of something larger, something that felt like the beginning of a real future rather than just survival. What will you tell Tommy when he's old enough to understand? She asked Jose as they rode through the mountain passes. About his parents, about what happened to them. Jose was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. The truth, he said finally, that his parents were good people who loved him, that they died protecting him, and that sometimes the world is a dangerous place, but there are people willing to stand up to that danger. And about us? About how we came to be his family? That too, Jose said, and Maria heard the warmth in his voice. That sometimes the best families aren't the ones you're born into, but the ones you choose. That love isn't just about blood, but about the decision to care for someone no matter what it costs you. Maria nodded, satisfied with his answer. It was a good philosophy, one that honored the past while embracing the future they were building together. The cabin looked different when they returned, somehow smaller and more precious than it had before. The bullet holes in the shutters and the broken window were reminders of how close they had come to losing everything, but they were also proof of their resilience, their ability to face adversity and emerge stronger. Over the following weeks, they settled into a new rhythm, one that acknowledged the deeper bonds that had formed between them during their trial by fire. Jose began work on expanding the cabin, adding a proper room for Tommy and improving the defenses in case of future trouble. Maria planted a larger garden and began planning for the livestock they would need to support a growing family. Because that's what they were now, she realized. Not just three people thrown together by circumstance, but a real family bound by choice and commitment and the kind of love that develops when people stand together against the darkness. Tommy thrived in their care, growing stronger and more alert with each passing day. He began to smile in earnest, reaching for their faces with tiny hands that seemed to recognize them as the constants in his young life. Maria found herself looking forward to each milestone, each small sign of his developing personality. "He's going to be tall like his father," she observed one evening as she fed him, noting how his small body was beginning to fill out the clothes she had made for him. "And stubborn like his uncle," Jose added with a grin, watching as Tommy determinedly refused to let go of the spoon Maria was trying to use to feed him. "My brother always said the Walker men were too pig-headed for their own good." "That's not necessarily a bad thing," Maria said. "Stubborn can be another word for determined, for refusing to give up when things get difficult. Like refusing to give up on a mountain man and a baby who showed up on your doorstep in the middle of a storm." Maria met his eyes, seeing in them the affection and respect that had grown between them over the weeks of shared danger and daily cooperation. Exactly like that. As autumn deepened into winter, their small family faced the challenges that came with isolation and harsh weather, but they faced them together. Jose's hunting kept them supplied with meat. Maria's careful management of their resources ensured they never went hungry, and Tommy provided the kind of joy and purpose that made even the hardest days worthwhile. The first major snowfall came in late November, blanketing their mountain home in pristine white and effectively cutting them off from the outside world until spring. But instead of feeling trapped, Maria found herself reveling in the enforced intimacy, the way the small space and shared responsibilities drew them closer together. "Do you ever regret it?" Jose asked one evening as they sat by the fire, Tommy sleeping peacefully in his cradle while the wind howled outside. "Taking us in, I mean. Your life was simpler before we came along." Maria looked up from the shirt she was mending, one of several that had been damaged during their confrontation with the raiders. The question deserved serious consideration, and she gave it the thought it warranted before responding. "Simpler, yes," she said finally, "but not better. I was existing before you came, Jose, not living, going through the motions of survival without any real purpose or joy. You and Tommy, you gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope," she said simply. "The belief that tomorrow might be better than today, that there are still good things worth working toward. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger than my own grief." Jose nodded, understanding flickering in his dark eyes. "I know that feeling. After my brother died, after I saw what those men had done, I thought the world had gone completely dark. But then I held Tommy, felt how much he needed me, and I realized that giving up wasn't an option anymore. And now I think maybe the darkness isn't permanent. Maybe it's just something you have to push through to get to the light on the other side." Maria smiled, setting aside her mending to look at the scene before her. The cabin was warm and cozy, filled with the soft sounds of the sleeping baby and the comfortable presence of the man who had become so much more than a temporary guest. Outside, the storm raged, but inside they were safe, protected not just by walls and fire, but by the bonds they had forged through shared trials and mutual trust. "I love you," she said quietly, the words emerging without conscious decision, but feeling absolutely right the moment they left her lips. Jose's hand stilled on the piece of wood he was carving, a toy horse he was making for Tommy. When he looked up, his eyes held a warmth that made her heart skip. "I love you too," he said, and the simple words carried the weight of absolute truth. "Both of you, more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." The admission hung between them, transforming the air in the cabin, making official what had been growing between them for weeks. They were no longer just three people sharing space and resources. They were a family in every sense that mattered, bound together by choice and commitment and the kind of deep affection that could weather any storm. "What happens now?" Maria asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "Now we build a life together," Jose said, moving to sit beside her on the small bench. "We raise Tommy to be a good man. We work this land. We face whatever challenges come our way as a team. If you'll have me, if you think you can stand being married to a stubborn mountain man with more scars than sense." Maria laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the warm cabin. "I think I can manage that. Though I should warn you, I'm pretty stubborn myself. It might be an interesting combination." "I'm counting on it," Jose said, and leaned down to kiss her, sealing the promise they were making to each other and to the child sleeping peacefully nearby. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside their small sanctuary, three people who had found each other against all odds settled in to weather whatever challenges the future might bring. They had learned that family wasn't always about blood, that love could grow from the simplest acts of kindness, and that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings led to the most beautiful endings. As the fire crackled in the stove and Tommy stirred softly in his sleep, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with a knock on her door during a storm, a desperate man seeking shelter for a helpless child. It had continued through shared dangers and daily cooperation, through moments of fear and instances of courage, through the gradual building of trust and affection. And now, as winter settled over their mountain home like a protective blanket, it was becoming something even more precious. A love story born of necessity, but sustained by choice. A family created not by accident of birth, but by the deliberate decision to care for each other no matter what the cost. Spring would come eventually, bringing with it new challenges and opportunities. There would be decisions to make about Tommy's education, about expanding their small homestead, about their place in the larger community. But for now, in the warm glow of firelight, in the quiet contentment of a family at peace, the future could wait. They had found something worth fighting for, worth building a life around. They had discovered that love could indeed grow from the darkest circumstances, that hope could flourish even in the face of tragedy, and that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as the most desperate needs. The mountain man who had arrived covered in blood with a baby in his arms had found more than just shelter that stormy night. He had found a home, a partner, and a future worth believing in. The lonely widow who had opened her door to strangers had discovered that her capacity for love was far from exhausted, that she still had room in her heart for the kind of family she had always dreamed of having. And the baby sleeping peacefully in his handmade cradle would grow up surrounded by the love of two people who had chosen to be his parents, who had fought for his safety and would continue to fight for his happiness for all the years to come. As the last log settled in the fire and the cabin grew quiet except for the soft sounds of breathing and the distant whisper of wind through the pines, Maria allowed herself to believe that they had truly found their happy ending. Not the fairy tale version where everything was perfect and easy, but the real-world version where happiness was something you built day by day, choice by choice, through dedication and sacrifice, and the simple decision to keep loving even when it was difficult. The storm outside was beginning to abate, the wind dying down to a gentle whisper. But inside their small sanctuary, the warmth would last all through the long winter night and into the bright promise of tomorrow. They were home, all three of them, and they were family, and that was enough to face whatever the future might bring. In years to come, when Tommy was old enough to understand the story of how his unusual family came to be, they would tell him about the night his uncle carried him through a storm to find safety, about the woman who opened her door to strangers and chose to love them both. They would tell him about courage and kindness, about the way people could come together in the face of adversity and create something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. But most of all, they would tell him that he was loved deeply and completely by two people who had chosen to be his parents, not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because he had brought light into their darkness and given them a reason to believe in tomorrow. And as the years passed and their small family grew and prospered, as Tommy learned to walk and talk and eventually to understand the full story of his origins, that love would remain the constant foundation of their lives together. The unshakable truth that had emerged from a stormy night when a desperate man knocked on a lonely woman's door and changed all their lives forever. The mountain man had returned covered in blood with a baby in his arms, seeking nothing more than basic shelter and sustenance. But he had found something infinitely more precious, something that would sustain him through all the challenges and joys of the years ahead. He had found home and family and the kind of love that makes all the darkness worthwhile. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.